Professor Chambliss is with us to deliver a talk entitled Mapping a Comic Imaginary. Professor Chambliss.
Thank you. So, hopefully everybody can hear me. I want to first start out by saying thank you to the center for offering me this invitation to talk. Of course, it's always a great honor to talk to your colleagues about your work. And this particular talk is very much about a project that's in progress, a group project that sort of brings together the two things I always remind myself I'm supposed to be doing, comics and DH. I want to start my talk, though, by grounding it in a question of the imaginary, which I want to say straight from the beginning, it's mostly urban for me. So there are lots of different imaginaries that we can talk about, but my concern is primarily an urban imaginary. So the literature on urban imaginaries are vast and vigorous. One of the things that's happened in the last few years is that the idea of the urban imaginary has perhaps become a key sort of focal point to bring together various kinds of interdisciplinary conversations about creation of the urban environment, about modernity, about the future aspect of how society will be organized and orchestrated globally at some level, because we've already sort of established a point where we're going to be, from a human standpoint, a primarily urban population, right? Most of the people live in cities, and whatever solutions or problems are associated with those spaces will become the solutions and problems for the globe. So when we talk about urban imaginaries, the recent publication of the Routledge Guides to Urban Imaginaries just last year, or really early this year, talked about there are multiple kinds of imaginaries, from the smart city to the eco-city. The question of urban resiliency is key. There's also this question of a kind of urban nostalgia, a vintage urban space, multilingual cities, many kind of cultural spaces that are tied up in the urban imaginary. Film, photography, all these things help build that landscape. So part of the thing I want to talk about is that my own concern with the urban imaginary really starts from the work I did on my dissertation, which was primarily about planning in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. My concern is rooted primarily in that initial effort on the part of reformers, artists, activists to shape and reshape the urban experience through a consistent, at some level, almost fanatical engagement with the imaginary. When we talk about the progressive era, it's important to recognize that much of the work to try to transform the city, to reform the city, is not necessarily dependent on the kind of technical heft that we might associate with city planning today or the construction of the physical space. It's much more a set of narratives that are grounded in the potential for what the space could be. So when you look at these early plans and these early sort of campaigns, they're really predicated on artists, reformers, and scholars looking at the actual space in juxtaposition with the dreams of what they could happen. This is primarily something I wrote about a lot when I think about the plan in Chicago, which these images are drawn from. Much of this work is sort of predicated on capturing the problems associated with the reality of the city at the time and juxtaposing it against visions that could be created through art, through the imagination of a better urban future. So images like this, of course, Jacob Riis is very famous for his How the Other Half Lives, but he's also one of the first people to really employ photography to capture the dangers posed by the congestion of the modern American city. I often think about almost unheard of figure today, J. Horace McFarlane, who's called Mr. City Beautiful, in part because he traveled around the country giving talks where he would photograph the sort of ugly parts of the city and marry that with artist renditions and depictions of what that ugly place could be, and to help reformers elect officials that would pursue the kind of reforms that will allow them to pursue beautification and reorganizing the urban space. So when I look at a tome like The Plan of Chicago, and this is my personal copy, I took a picture of this for an article. Yeah, I have a personal copy of The Plan of Chicago. What I always remind students, and I always remind people when I talk about it, there's nothing in there that really is about what the actual city is. It's all a history of greatness in the past and a call for people to embrace a set of decisions and visions that will create greatness in the future. So the imaginary is incredibly important to any discussion of our physical environment. It's this interchange between the real and the imagined that I often think of as critical to the creation of policy, critical to the reactions that shape public debates, critical at some level to what we expect in terms of the physical environment and what we hope can be discerned. Now, I've said all this, but you're like, so what? We were promised comics. And that's a legitimate point. What I often tell students, among other things, comic history is urban history. And in fact, if you go down to the first floor, the exhibit in the special collection is Comics in the City, which I co-created in relation to the MSU Comics Forum, because in my head, comics history is urban history. Now, for comic studies, this sort of relationship between comics and the city is not in any way, shape, or form a revelation. Indeed, when we look at comic historians like Ian Gordon, they talk about comic books as a product of modernity that both document the city and its transformations, but also create a context for understanding for urban residents about those transformations. So famously, a comic that we associate with sort of the beginning of the modern comic era, The Yellow Kid, has many problems in terms of like its depiction of race, but it's actually at some level a commercialized cataloging of the transformation that's taking place on the streets of American cities in the late 1890s. A commercial phenomenon, the characters in Yellow Kid are really cataloging these people who are coming into the country and creating the tableau of the modern American city. And for a lot of residents, this transformation allows them to play out sort of stereotypical, racialized depictions of different minorities, African Americans, white ethnic groups. But it's also, as Gordon points out, a humorous tool to allow them to get over the stress that they associate with the loss, the sort of homogeneous communities of the 19th century and the emergence of the urban heterogeneous communities, drawing from very different parts of the world and bringing very different cultural narratives to the fore. So the comic book page and the comic book characters and the comic book space is a complicated one. There's a comic book geography that we can associate with the urban imaginary. And this is geography I'm particularly concerned with. When I think about comic books, I'm thinking about them in part as a space of potentialities around this urban imaginary. So one way to consider this is to think about potential concerns about space, right? The relationship that might be understood by engaging with the comic page. So there are some tensions here that are fairly obvious. One is a place, space, and then there's a context, content, sort of dichotomy that we're often thinking about when we think about the comic book page. So this representation of content and this sort of like placement of space becomes a real opportunity at some level when we start thinking about the comic book page. So these archives of potentiality I associate with comic books offer up a moment of engagement. And they call our attention to how the comic book form creates the context for visual narratives that readers and society use to process potentialities around modernity, right? So the comic book page isn't just simply a sort of popular culture space, it's also a space where the potentialities around reading strategies and sort of cognitive engagement around modernity play themselves out in multiple ways. So we can see this in different sort of moments in comic history. Of course, whenever we talk about Superman, we can think about that character as a contemporary incarnation as a character that represents sort of American power, almost American excess. Famously, of course, only the United States has superheroes. Other people don't necessarily have superheroes, but the United States takes the concept of an illustrated story and pushes it to a very different place. But it's important to recognize that the origins of these characters, of course, as lots of comic scholars will tell you, is connected to sort of transformative moments of the 1930s, of the reformist governments of the New Deal, of the challenge here of a kind of regulatory state that's being created to help the little man, to help protect society. So the early Superman is not the Superman that we know so well. The Superman of that early period is a character who is striving to help the downtrodden, who saves someone who's wrongly accused of a crime from execution, who abuses at some level the money elite who are exploiting the workers, who intervenes at some level against those people with power to protect those people without it. So he's a character that really does represent the aspirations of that particular moment. And that's part of its appeal, I would argue, even today, that Superman still remains anchored to that moment of creation, the idea of the regulatory state. Comics, no doubt, are no doubt a popular medium, and they evolve in the sort of consumer landscape of the United States. So a popular medium in the 1930s and 1940s with a reform element is transformed with the inclusion of other kinds of narratives, right? So as we move through the war period, superheroes lose their popularity, but other genres emerge to drive the story. So the emergence of the horror comic and the romance comic almost at the same time, and produced by some of the same creators that created some of those very famous superhero comics, is really a commentary on the transformations associated with the sort of post-war American mindset. The baby boom and the sort of push to put women back into the home, to fulfill gender roles that were associated with that sort of post-war transformation, that we can attach to the romance comics. And they fit very neatly into that domestic containment, as Elaine Tyler May talks about when she talks about the post-war period. Or we think about horror comics as a place where the traumas of war, not easily articulated in the public sphere, are playing themselves out as veterans are writing and drawing stories that call into question the hypocrisy sometimes of the power elite and the consequences that that may lead. So these genres also become a way for us to think about comics as evolving as a place where the potential stories, the potential relationships, the potential challenges associated with the American experience play themselves out so well. But the question always is there more to see? And of course, how do we see it? For me, this question very much is at the fore. And when I came to MSU, the opportunity to sort of like work with people in a digital project was foremost in my mind. In part because even before I got here, I had thought about ways that we might look at the comic page in a big sort of DH way and try to see patterns around these potentialities, these sort of pathways around the imaginary, and how they may intersect and inflect how the public is understanding urban transformation. So I always like to say I don't code, right? So it's like, to me, the simplest tool is the best. So I did a little experiment where I was like, maybe there's a way for me to use 10i to look at urban images and try to figure out ways to see how those images are fitting into a particular kind of pattern. I actually talked to a couple of colleagues who do comic studies. We went back and forth, and we couldn't figure it out. We didn't have the technical skills. We didn't think 10i was going to work. Of course, everything's different now that I'm at Digital Mecca. That's what I like to call MSU. That was a joke. You can laugh. It's okay. Right. Because here, of course, there is a tremendous DH community, and upon my arrival, I recognized that the MSU library already had a digital community that was concerned with thinking about data and data sets. And in particular, the data set research was something that was ongoing. And this is really important to my story because in part, the data set group had established some project where they looked at library catalog data and used it to create data sets that could be used for research. And of course, I'm contractually obligated to point out that MSU has the largest publicly available collection of comic books in the world. I'm not contractually obligated to say that. That too was a joke. But I say it a lot, so there you go. Now, my concern with the imaginary and comics as a catalog of the urban experience intersects very much with the already established practice of digital humanities in the library in a particular way, because there was a grant called Collections as Data, Part to Whole, that was available that the library group decided they wanted to try to go for, and they needed a content guy, and who knows comics? I do. So I joined the team. So it's very much a team effort. We didn't get that grant. We were slapped down because I think we were doing a grant about comics because we wanted to do something with the comics collection. But we recognized in this group that exploration of the comics collection through a DH project was a viable project. And so we decided to continue on. And we'll talk more about this in greater detail next week, because we're going to do a roundtable at the MSU Comics Forum, February 21st and 22nd, Friday in the library. I have to promote everything. We're going to be doing that starting at 1 right here in the library, so check it out. You get all the details, because all the members of the team will be there. I'll be there too, but they can tell you about all the sort of like inner workings of how collections of data has developed here at the library. What I will say, of course, is that because of that massive collection, we were talking about ways that we might approach the data set. What can we do with this data set? Now, it's important to recognize that when we talk about collections of data and we talk about comic books, visualizations of various types are not new, right? If you Google around on the internet, you can find a number of DH projects that look to visualizations like this, which is just the covers of Avenger magazine, Avenger comics over time. So one struggle, I think, in terms of our discussion is like, what are we going to try to do in terms of this question of digitization? Because one obvious element, because comics are a visual medium, is that if you're going to do a DH project, surely you must digitize something. And so for us, the question becomes, how do we get to the place to figure out what to digitize? This was an important part of our discussion. Not just simply we're going to digitize comics. We don't need a grant for that, nor do we need a team for that. What we need is to figure out what's meaningful to digitize and why, right? So this starts on a process of looking at the comic book collection, and in particular, looking at the MARC record from the catalog, comic book catalog. And we came up with a sample, a mere 50,000 lines. That is a joke, that's a lot. It's not mere 50,000 lines. I just say mere 50,000 lines to take the edge off of all the horror. But this sample of North American comics became something that we exported from the catalog collection and then went through a process of cleaning. So the grant opportunity was in 2018, my first year here. We got slapped down, we did not get that grant. So we worked on this in the spring semester and through the summer to clean the data, quote unquote, clean the data, to make it structured enough for us to try to do something with. So this sample that we have, this 50,000 lines of library catalog data, comprises North America. And having gone through this process of creating this sort of sample set, I started to look at it as a way of building and exploring visualizations based on this idea of the imaginary, right? As I say, I'm not a techie, so I had to think about different tools that might be available for me to create visualizations. So one tool that I hit upon is Flourish, and after watching several videos, YouTube videos, playing around with Flourish, I made an initial visualization based on the catalog data, the sample data that looks like this, right? And people were like, oh, that looks cool, because Flourish has a lot of templates, and those templates are very pretty. The problem for me, and the problem for anyone who's sort of like a comic scholar, there's nothing surprising about the fact that New York is a huge part of this collection. Because of the catalog data, this is library catalog data, right? So this is the data that was used when the object arrives in the library to create the catalog data. So when you search for something in the catalog, you can find it, right? So it has all that sort of Dublin core kind of data. In particular, in this data set, I'm looking at place of publication as a way to sort of rethink the way of thinking about the catalog data, right? So in part, it's not just simply about where the comics themselves are talking about. In particular, for this data set, there's an opportunity here to think about where locality in terms of publication might be influencing the images of comics themselves. So when you see this sort of visualization, this is telling you where the comics in the data set were published, right? And as I say, when you look at it different ways, well, yeah, of course, New York is the center of that. It's the biggest one, right? Because the already established qualitative history of comics publication has already pointed out to us that, yes, New York, Tokyo, France, right? Like, you know, these are places, Paris, these are places where comics are published. This fits very neatly within our narrative of comics history and comics culture, a very vigorous and very well-established subfield. But my argument, and what I hope to continue to develop, is to think about all these other cities that make, to you, very little sense. I mean this in the general public, very little sense as locations of publications of comics, right? Because what do you know about comic publication in Burbank, right? What do you know about comic publication in Racine, right? So this offers up the opportunity, all the work we've done up to this point really offers up the opportunity to visualize relationships related to publication of comics in North America in a way that perhaps will reveal hidden relationships in terms of creators, communities, and practice in comics, right? So this is the opportunity that's created by all the work that we've done up to this point. It's to create a data set that might be queried in a way that will allow us to identify patterns of creativity, patterns of community, patterns of practice that will help shape and reshape our understanding of comics. So the team has been working, we've been working on this, and after a certain point when you're working with any kind of DH project, you know, you have to say, we gotta stop, because otherwise you'll never stop. Like it's like hell, like you're like trapped there, like doing it over and over again. That last part was a joke. It's not like hell. It was, okay, you guys are a tough crowd. But you have to establish a baseline stop point and say, hey, here you go. And so we've aimed for that this semester with our efforts to stop our cleaning, write up the project with a README, create a site, a web presence. The whole team's working on this, and we're actually doing a lot of presentations. This is why we're presenting at the MSU Comics Forum. We're also going to present at Haystack. We just submitted proposals to that. And smarter data people than me have started making visualizations with Flourish, and so you start to see stuff that looks like this. So this is a location over time graph that's in Flourish. So once we get this up and running, we'll have a number of these sample visualizations along with the README and the clean data set and the unclean data set that people can use to do their own investigations, right? So as you can see, what we see is an opportunity at some level with this simple visualization sort of like visualize that transformation over time. The baseline is of course, the sample years, and then it just runs, and then where you see those blooms. Hopefully, what I hope to do, what I'm planning on doing, what I'm thinking about very actively, is how I can take this data set, now that we sort of cleaned it, and build on my skills, my limited skills with Flourish, to start thinking about ways to dissect the data set, to really call our attention to those spaces that are not New York. And also think about how the catalog data might allow me to map out relationships in terms of not just simply the location of publication, but the people who are publishing, like the authors, the inkers, the letterers, so on and so forth. Because of course, from my perspective, when we think about the imaginary, when we think about the urban imaginary, when we think about this relationship between the real and the imagined, history suggests that these imagined spaces have a very strong relationship to the choices that are made in real spaces. And if, in the case of comics, those relationships which permeate the sort of popular imagination around cities, both symbolic and sometimes real, because of course, many comic book cities are allegories to real cities, right? We all know Metropolis is New York, the good part, and Gotham is New York, the bad part, right? We've long established that. But with the evolution of comic publication towards more alternative narratives that take into account the experience of people of color, women, LGBTQ, or autobiographical narratives that are set in locations that are not necessarily urban, that might be rural, how do those comic narratives fit into relationships and networks of creation that impact our imaginary when it comes to the city and community? So I'm rambled on a little bit, but I'm gonna leave this with Mo Galactus to sum up, because Mo Galactus is a curation of John Jennings and Stacey Robinson, Black Kirby, which is a piece that they were here last year. And I wanted to make a call out to my colleagues in the group, to the Collections Data group, Scout, Calvert, myself, Devin Higgins, Ronti Junis, Kristen Mapes, and Kate Topham. All of us have been working on this all together, and this project will continue, but ultimately how it continues really becomes a question of how people will engage with it in terms of creating these different visualizations and creating queries to this data set that might reveal different kinds of knowledge about the comic imaginary. So that's my talk, and I'd be happy to take some questions and try to clarify anything that wasn't clear. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Julian. That was awesome. No, really, I love being able to hear what my colleagues do, and I'm so glad to finally hear about this project from you in this kind of setting. So I have more of a content question.
Sure.
What accounts for Wisconsin being a hotbed of comic publication?
Right. So it's a particular publisher, and I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but yeah, it's about the publication, and I think in that particular case, that's a place where some of the Dell and Key. Okay, that right. You're right. So when we say comics in the United States, what do you think I mean? You naturally you think Marvel Comics, right? Everyone's heard of Marvel Comics. And you've heard of DC Comics, right? Right? But how many people remember Gold Key? Right. Gold Key Comics was a comic publisher that was very active from the 50s through the early 70s. Dell, another major comic book publisher, also active from the 50s to the 70s. Dell is very famous for publishing a number of media tie-in comics. We think of that as a contemporary phenomenon, but think Walt Disney had comics, right? Donald Duck and things like that. Well, they didn't publish those. They licensed those to another publisher, Dell, right? Dell published those Warner Brother Bugs Bunny, all that stuff, right? It's published by them. So where do they publish it? Well, I think one of the places they published it is they hired this company and they published it in Racine, right? So when we get the catalog data, as the libraries will talk about, they're looking at the object and sort of reading what it says. And if it says it's published in Racine, it's published in Racine, right? As opposed to where we associate publication in the American context around comics, which is primarily New York, which is why I say, like, when you look at that initial sort of rundown, well, there's no shock there. The real story is, well, who are all these other people? And what are the relationships around all these other people, right? And one of the things that we've talked about is connecting the data that we have to other open data sources, like so Wikidata, so we can say like this publisher entity or the creator and sort of try to understand the relationship between not just simply the place of publication, but the communities around creativity that might have sprung up around these locations, right? So for instance, there's a lot of stuff happening in Oregon, but that's because primarily of Oni Press and Dark Horse Press, which are both publishers that have come online since the 1990s, and both do a lot of reprints, right? They print stuff from the golden age, right? And they do a lot of independent printing, and they do a lot of licensed printing. So Dark Horse, for instance, had the license for all the Star Wars stuff for many years. And they had the license for the Aliens and Predator comics, right? So it's these kinds of corporate relationships that denote some of these things, and entities that were publishing but no longer publish. And that's why time and location become really important in trying to understand what we see when we have like one of that visualization I showed you, because some of that happened only for 20 years, whereas they're still publishing Marvel in New York. Well, publishing is the wrong word because they publish in Korea, but they're still headquartered in New York, right? So that's the place of publication. So hopefully, yeah.
Do you see connections between place of publication and content at all in terms of the cities there?
Right, yeah, right. So of course that is the obvious question, right? So on the one hand, again, I always juxtapose this against a kind of qualitative approach, right? So I write about superheroes. Naturally, that's how I know Metropolis is New York in the good parts, and Gotham is New York in the bad parts, right? Because you read it that way through a kind of qualitative lens. I think one of the possibilities around this project is for us to test that case, right? Because I think, especially when we move away from things that are published in New York and start looking at what's actually being produced in these other locations, what will be the relationship around depiction of locality, right? Like how will place be depicted in the comics published in a different place, if that makes sense. So one way we thought about testing this is to look at how Detroit is depicted in comics. Just pick a place and go like, can we find out how Detroit looks in comics? And that's way more complicated than I want it to be, right? Because sometimes Detroit, for instance, is mentioned briefly in a comic, and there's like one single frame in a comic that's set in Detroit. And so Detroit is mentioned in sort of like qualitative material around, whereas other comic tales are set in Detroit, right? So Detroit Rock City is a comic, well, it's set in Detroit. But it's a manga, so it's not like a Detroit that you recognize necessarily, like it's a manga-inspired story. Or like Cyborg, which is a very well-known DC character. A lot of his adventures take place in Detroit, right? But up until recently, people creating the comic were not living in Detroit, right? But recently, they had a series where like one of the writers was actually from Detroit and his adventure was in Detroit, right? So what are the differences there? So yeah, that's the next step. Like, can we figure out, once we see locality in this sort of like machine way, are there ways for us to tease out how the pictures might shift. And remember, we're using catalog data, so there's a huge question here about how the data, we've had discussions about this, how the data was put in, and what did they decide, and how did they decide that, right? So there's a huge set of questions there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just to follow up on that last point, I was wondering whether you think the catalog data gives you a pretty good range of data to sort of sort and work with, or are there certain types of data that you just say, damn, why couldn't they have thought to include, X, Y, or...
I think my answer to that, because I'm not a librarian, right, is that it gives you data based on the protocols for ingesting material into the library catalog. And so there's almost a part of me that wants to like be with the cataloger and go, why is it that you think this, right? And I think the general answer from what I learned is that the catalogers are making good faith decisions around whatever they see, right? And if they don't have enough information, they go to the next best answer. So some of this, in terms of the cleaning, has been about trying to parse out, okay, what information is in this part of the catalog record traditionally, like what's the logic there, and what does it mean, and do we need it vis-a-vis the data set? And so we've had a lot of great conversation. I've learned a lot about cataloging and how cataloging logic works. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the question of is it enough from my perspective, yeah, I wish there was more, right? Like you want there to be like some sort of like little note about what was happening at the period that this was going on. Like, why are there so many that are X kinds of comics between this period and this period? Again, if this was a question of a qualitative analysis, I would make a judgment, as I often do when I write comics. We talk about popularity around comic books and comic characters, but we do that with very scant information on sales and how many people read, like we project, because it's very difficult to get those numbers. And so with this project, we're really sort of thinking, I think, at some level, how the institutional knowledge that represented in the library projects an image of comics to the world, right? And can we query that catalog record and try to create more nuance around that image that's being created? I think that we can, but again, at some level, this is the beginning of a project, and probably people are going to come to the data set. I mean, part of the goal here is to have a data set that people can use, and we're going to accomplish that. And people are going to take the data set and then start to do things with the data set that we would not have thought of, or stuff that I cannot do, right? Like they will have better skill set and they will be able to use it in a particular way. And I'm like, man, that's cool, right? So it's exciting because I think it is the start of a very particular set of conversations that can grow from the work. Yes.
I've had the opportunity last year, and then we'll again this year, to spend a pretty significant amount of time with the collection of this data from people. And one of the key questions that continues to be part of those conversations is how we go about thinking about and planning for data use and reuse. And so my question to you is, who do you imagine that audience of users to be?
I think that we talked about this. I think that this will be really useful for cultural scholars interested in cultural topics that have some data skill. When we release the data set, we'll release the sort of clean version that we created, but also the unclean version, so they can sort of see. I think it would be very interesting to, well, the librarians think, and I have no reason to doubt them, that it'll be really interesting to librarians and catalogers in terms of like trying to understand that. I think the visualizations that we create, and we are creating like a series of visualization with Flourish, will be interesting to people who are just curious about comics, right? Because as you know, as Amy said, what the hell is in Racine, right? Like what's in there, right? What's in Milwaukee, but that's Milwaukee, Oregon, not Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Okay, all right. See, this is a little, okay, it's good, okay, sorry. Yeah. My bad. Yes, that's Milwaukee. Sorry. That's Oregon, so that's,
So what the hell was Portland?
right, yeah. All right, yeah, right.
On the left side of the bubble?
So, yeah, it's Milwaukee, Oregon. So that's where Oni Press is, I think, right? And Dark Horse, they're both in like the suburbs of Portland.
Right, but the
Right.
licensing thing also plays a role too.
Right.
It's not just about publishing
Right,
comics.
yeah.
Nobody's surprised that publications come out of New York because it's known to be a good place to publish lots of things.
Right, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Following up on the previous points, I have a question about the quantitative and the qualitative, and you alluded to it a little bit. I'm thinking maybe you're going to say that that's for a future project, but is there a way of, or do you envision already a way of interfacing your data set with like Randy Scott's index? When you say Detroit, well, how do we find Detroit? It might not be in the subject of your data set.
Right.
But Randy's been indexing places and characters, and is there a way to make those two data sets communicate, or is that then just the job of the individual scholar? So
Is there a way to make those two? So that's a good question. The answer right now is no, because Randy's list it's a bibliographic list, right? So it's not and some we have to translate it into something that can be structured and read, right? This is why the idea of Wikidata is really important, because we have based on the catalog data, information that we've placed into this data set, and if we could link to entities in Wikidata, which is like basically sort of like informational entries about that thing, then that would be a way for us to connect more qualitative descriptions of the objects and the people related to the objects to this sort of quantitative information that's sort of structured in this spreadsheet. And we that's the next step. Like we talk about, like, yes, a logical next step would be to connect the data that's in this data set to Wikidata. So like when you have these patterns that you see in terms of location, you could dig into that location and start to see more information about individuals connected to the location, be it author, members of the creative team, and other sort of like relationships that would be visible within that location, right? So Randy's data, that was one of the first questions I asked, like, why, is there a way for us to move Randy's thing into the other thing? And everyone I asked that just says no. Not because the way he built it is not a simple exercise to like turn that into quote unquote structured data. It's just not. And we can't tap Randy's head and like translate that into structured data. So it's a challenge. The Wikidata is connecting the entities in our data set to Wikidata seems like the most obvious process that we're gonna, and who's gonna do that is not clear, because this is nobody's primary job. I just like to point that out. This is nobody's job. So everyone's been very excited about this project, and it's really always great to hear people they always seem to have a positive response to the potentiality of this project. But because it's not anyone's actual, it's not an actual, like we didn't get the grant, right? So it's not a grant funded thing. We're pushing to get to this moment where we have this data presence, this web presence, we have this data set, we have this website, and we, my hope is to like reach out to people who might be willing to use the data set and create their own set of visualizations and be in dialogue with them. But then we sort of have to stop and go like, are we going to apply for something based on the potentiality that we sort of demonstrated with what we have? And like that's a whole different set of discussions that we have to have. Right now we're like, okay, we're going to get this done and tell people, and my own personal things, just claim victory. Just drop the mic, walk away. But it's ongoing. Yes.
I guess this is a good segue from where you were at with that. I remember when this project started, there were a number of discussions over like what library collection to use. As MSU has like the
Right.
Media collection, there's the BBL, the voice library upstairs. Do you foresee this group or portions of this group like replicating this work again in the future? Do you think that would be of value for different collections?
So I'm going to tell you the truth. I think that's a perfectly reasonable question, but I don't know what the internal stresses around this group, like for instance, the data group at all, right? Because like I said, like this is nobody's job, and we kind of soldiered on because like this is a good idea. We all agree this is a good idea, but we did it, in the corner of everybody's real job, and I think we did a good job, right? But so that's the challenge, I think, internally to the library, right? Like I'm like basically the only not library person, right? So I'm just like an interloper that comes through, like, hey guys, we gonna do that data thing? Like, hi. There are clearly, the strength of the collection in popular culture offers opportunity for this kind of work to be super meaningful. But I couldn't tell you realistically what the internal narrative within the library about like these projects it is exactly, because I'm not a librarian, right? But yeah, like if from my perspective as someone who deals with comics, the comics collection, we picked North America for obvious reasons, right? I'm an Americanist. I was a content guy. I think if we got some of our colleagues from the College of Arts and Letters and Languages, they could really do something with this whole process. But again, like it would have to be like a whole conversation about making that happen. And I hope that happens. Like my goal, like I say, is to like stabilize the project and use the data set we have, because I think that data set might actually inspire some real engagement and reveal some unique relationships. So I'm hoping that we'll actually get this up and running. People will see it, and then we'll revisit the idea of like, okay, now that we have this, let's apply for a grant. And then that will clarify how much time, energy, and opportunity we'll have around continuing with this process. Because clearly there's a long legacy of this data set stuff at the library, right? It existed before me. It's not me that caused this to happen. I just showed up and like, yes, I will help. So I'm assuming that those people and that desire remains. And this is just a question of like, let's seize an opportunity that may come away, because there might be a new grant that moves that along. I mean, they reissued that grant that we got turned down for, but they rewrote it in such a way that like there was no way that we could we could reapply. Like it was the language was very different. It was like, just no way. I think a different collection was used for the second time. So I would say stay tuned. And hopefully this will be so great that people will be like, oh yeah, we're gonna do that again, right? Truthfully.